I woke up to the chiming sound of a Facebook notification, the screen of my phone casting a cold blue glow in the otherwise dark bedroom. Rubbing the sleep from my eyes, I glanced at the message request. Chris Matthews wants to connect. The name took me back, a snapshot of high school memories flooding my mind. Chris, the awkward but funny guy who sat behind me in chemistry class. I hadn't thought about him in years, and seeing his name again stirred up an uncomfortable feeling, something hard to pin down. We weren't close back then, not really, but his name lingered in old yearbooks and whispered rumors. Against my better judgment, I accepted the request. Almost immediately, another message appeared. Hey, we should catch up. Dinner tomorrow night. Felt sudden, but curiosity got the better of me, and I agreed. We arranged to meet at a little Italian place in town. The next evening, I arrived early. The restaurant was cozy, the smell of garlic and baked bread wafting through the air. I fidgeted with my napkin, my eyes darting to the door every time it creaked open. And then he arrived. Chris looked different. Older, obviously, but there was something else. His eyes didn't seem to focus right, like he was constantly distracted by something just over my shoulder. His smile stretched thin, his voice oddly formal, as if we were strangers at a networking event rather than old classmates catching up. I tried to make small talk, asking about where he'd been, what he'd been doing all these years, but his answers were vague. He avoided direct eye contact, his fingers drumming anxiously on the table. So, where did you disappear to? I finally asked, trying to inject some humor into my tone. Chris's smile faltered, and his gaze dropped to his barely touched plate. You shouldn't have ignored me back then, he muttered. My stomach twisted. It was a strange thing to say, a needle of accusation wrapped in something unsettling. I laughed it off awkwardly, but Chris didn't join in. Instead, he stood up abruptly. I have to go, he said, his voice hollow. Before I could respond, he slipped out of the restaurant, leaving me sitting there in a cloud of confusion. The messages began the next morning. Every day, without fail, I'd get a message from Chris. You shouldn't have ignored me back then. It was always the same, each one a painful echo, each one pushing me further into an unease I couldn't shake. I tried blocking him, but new accounts kept cropping up, his messages relentless, as if they were growing more insistent, more desperate. A few nights later, I couldn't sleep. The feeling of being watched was unbearable, a crawling sensation on my skin, making my breath come out in shallow gasps. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, and I snatched it up, heart pounding. This time it was a photo. It was my house, taken from the street, the lights still on in my living room. My hands shook as I stared at the image. I called the police, my voice cracking with panic, but when they arrived, there was no sign of anyone outside. They told me to lock my doors and call if anything happened again. The messages stopped, suddenly and completely, the silence almost worse. I scoured Facebook for any sign of Chris, but it was as if he'd never existed. When I called up old classmates, they grew awkward, sidestepped my questions. One even mentioned that Chris had disappeared 10 years ago, just weeks after graduation. I couldn't comprehend it. I'd just seen him. I'd had dinner with him. Then, 2 nights later, I woke to a sharp pain in my chest. Gasping, I sat up, only to find myself looking into Chris's face. He was standing in the shadowed corner of my bedroom, his eyes wide and unblinking, his smile stretched grotesquely. He stepped closer, and I tried to scream, but the pressure in my chest became unbearable. My vision blurred, fading at the edges. As the darkness swallowed me whole, I heard his voice one last time, whispering in my ear, "You shouldn't have ignored me." The morning news reported my death as a sudden heart failure. No one would ever know what really happened, how an old friend had come back, not for a catch-up, but for a final silent revenge. The campfire crackled in the crisp autumn air, sending up sparks that fizzled into the dark sky above. Our group had hiked for hours, deep into the woods surrounding Lake Braddock, searching for the perfect camping spot. We had gathered around a ring of flames, its orange glow dancing on our faces, warding off the night chill. It was Brian who started it, his voice taking on that eerie storyteller's cadence that he always used when telling ghost stories. "These woods are haunted," he said, and we all groaned. "Come on," someone muttered. But Brian persisted, his eyes narrowing as he leaned closer to the flames. "Seriously," he continued, "I've got a real story this time. One my uncle told me when I was a kid. Happened in these very woods." There was something different in his tone. His usual bravado felt strained, forced. A chill knot from the autumn breeze raced up my spine. Brian took a breath and then began. "Years ago, there was a guy named Peter Dawson, an experienced outdoorsman. One summer, he went hiking just like us, but he never came home. His wife reported him missing, and a massive search ensued. They scoured every inch of these woods but never found a trace. Some people said he got lost, but others whispered that he met a more unnatural fate. We all fell quiet. Even the rustling leaves and distant owl calls seemed to pause. The night suddenly felt thicker, heavier, like the forest itself was holding its breath. But then," Brian continued, his voice barely more than a whisper, "2 weeks later, people began hearing footsteps at night, strange noises that echoed through the trees. Some claimed they saw a lone figure wandering the woods, wearing the same old hiking boots and green jacket Peter Dawson had been wearing the day he disappeared. I shifted on my log, feeling the icy fingers of unease grip my chest. The flickering light of the fire didn't seem so comforting anymore, the shadows beyond stretching wider, deeper. Brian locked eyes with me then, a smile playing at his lips. "They say he never found his way back. Until tonight." He stood up suddenly, his shadow growing tall and monstrous in the firelight. I rolled my eyes, even as my heart slammed against my ribs. "Oh, come on," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But Brian didn't laugh. He stepped away from the fire, his movements unnaturally stiff, mechanical. The hair on my arms stood on end. I couldn't tell if it was a joke anymore. The fire popped and hissed. "Brian?" someone called out, but he didn't turn. He kept walking, each step echoing too loud in the clearing, fading into the whispering woods. "Hey, man!" someone else called, but Brian was already swallowed by darkness. We sat there, stunned, the silence pressing down on us, each of us too afraid to break it. Then came a sound, a low, rustling noise from the woods, followed by the snap of a twig. I turned, the forest alive with whispers and creaks. Brian didn't come back. He never came back. We called his name over and over, our voices cracking with fear. The hours dragged by, our circle tightening around the dying fire. Finally, the sun crested the horizon, but it brought no answers, only the empty clearing and the chilling echo of Brian's story, one that felt more real with every fading ember. "Don't open that door. Not unless you want to know what's waiting." I read those words carved deeply into the frame of the old padlocked door. The wood around the message splintered as if someone had dug into it with a desperate hand, trying to warn or perhaps to keep something at bay. My wife and I had just moved into this century-old house, a fixer-upper with creaky floors and whispers in the walls. The door was the only part we couldn't explain away, the only part we couldn't forget. It stood in the center of the basement, the padlock rusted, the chains taut, as if holding the door shut from the inside. The realtor had been evasive, claiming it was locked for safety reasons. But every night it called to me, gnawed at the back of my mind. I lay awake, hearing the faint groans of the house settling, the occasional clink of metal against wood. Weeks passed, and the house took on our presence. New paint, new furniture, even new energy. But that door remained, untouched yet never quite out of mind. It didn't help that each night I'd dream of it. In my dreams, it would be swinging open, revealing only darkness and an overwhelming sense of dread that stuck to me like sweat even after I woke. The day I decided to open it was a mistake. But curiosity does that to you. Plants itself takes root and won't let go until you give in. I waited until the afternoon, the sun pouring through the basement's small, grimy windows, bathing the place in the illusion of safety. I brought down a heavy-duty bolt cutter, determined and foolish. As the padlock broke with a loud snap, the door groaned in protest, the chains slithering to the floor like dead serpents. The silence that followed was deafening, the whole house seeming to pause, holding its breath. I pulled the door open, and a cold draft swept over me, carrying the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic. The room was empty. No skeletons, no hidden treasure, not even a stray cobweb. Just a large, antique mirror, propped against the far wall. Dust danced in the air, catching the slivers of sunlight, and I felt a pang of disappointment mixed with relief. But as I approached the mirror, I noticed something wrong, something deeply, unsettlingly wrong. My reflection wasn't mirroring my movements. I stopped, my heart pounding, and watched as the me in the mirror tilted its head slightly, a grin spreading across its face. I stumbled back, but my reflection didn't move. It stayed there, watching me, its eyes too wide, its smile too sharp. My own face, but twisted, as if painted with a cruel mockery of my expression. I turned to leave, my legs trembling, but the door was no longer there. The room was shrinking, the walls closing in, the air growing thicker. Panic surged through me, every rational thought drowned out by the primal urge to escape. I banged on where the door should have been, my fists meeting solid, unyielding wood. Behind me, the mirror version of myself stepped out. I felt its cold breath against my neck, and I couldn't bring myself to turn around. "You let me out," it whispered, my voice but not quite right, distorted, malicious. Its hands grabbed my shoulders, and as I felt myself being pulled backward, everything went dark. When my wife came home that evening, she found the basement empty. The chains lay discarded on the floor, the mirror shattered into 1,000 jagged shards, but I was gone. The police never found any trace of me. The only clue, the words etched into the broken pieces of the mirror, pieces that seemed to hum with a life of their own. "He's out now, and you can never lock him away again." It started with the pictures. I woke up one morning to find a Polaroid photo slipped under my front door. I hadn't owned a Polaroid camera in years, but there it was, lying face down on the worn-out doormat. When I picked it up, a chill raced down my spine. It was a photo of me, asleep in my bed, taken from a low angle near my bedroom door. I live alone. My first reaction was to rationalize. Maybe it was a prank, I thought, some sick joke played by a friend. But deep down, the fear gripped me, made my hands tremble as I examined the photo. My room looked exactly how I'd left it the night before. The open book on the nightstand, the half-drunk glass of water, the covers twisted around my legs. The details were too perfect, too intimate. I shook it off, convincing myself it was nothing, an overactive imagination, perhaps. But then the second photo appeared. This time, I found it on my bathroom sink, balanced against the mirror as if waiting for me. It showed me, again, sleeping, this time from the side of the bed, the angle impossible unless someone had been standing right there, just inches away from me. Panic bloomed in my chest. I checked every lock, every window, every possible entry point, but everything was secure. I bought a security camera, something to catch whoever was tormenting me. That night, I barely slept, my mind racing with every creak and groan of the house. The feeling of being watched was a living thing, pressing down on me, tightening around my throat. The third photo was the worst. I found it on the kitchen table right next to my morning coffee. It showed me standing in the middle of my room, eyes wide open, staring into the darkness. Except I had no memory of getting up in the middle of the night. My skin crawled as I realized I'd been wandering in my sleep. But what made it worse was the angle. It was taken from outside the window, through the glass, like someone had been standing out there, waiting. The days blurred together. Sleep became a stranger, replaced by the oppressive weight of insomnia and creeping dread. I watched the security footage each morning, desperate to catch some proof, but all I ever saw was myself, shuffling around my room at night, my eyes glassy, unfocused. And then, one morning, I saw something else. The footage showed me standing in the corner of my bedroom, Polaroid camera in hand, snapping photo after photo of myself asleep. My movements were stiff, my expression vacant, like I wasn't even there. I had been the one taking the photos all along. I slammed the laptop shut, heart thundering in my chest, sweat slicking my palms. But why couldn't I remember? Why did it feel like I was becoming a stranger to myself? I tried to explain it away. Stress, I thought. Maybe I was overworked, cracking under pressure. But the photos kept coming, piling up on my kitchen table, each one more disturbing than the last. The angles were impossible, photos from the ceiling, from corners that shouldn't exist. I told myself I was hallucinating, that the camera was broken, that I wasn't losing my grip on reality. But the whispers started next. Little murmurs, so quiet I couldn't tell if they were inside my head or echoing through the walls. They would repeat the same things over and over, a litany of self-doubt, a mockery of my sanity. You're doing this. You know you are. The world tilted, fractured. My thoughts spiraled, and I began questioning everything. Had I ever really set up that security camera? Was I even awake now? The shadows in the corners of my vision grew darker, fuller, whispering things I refused to hear. One morning, I woke up clutching the Polaroid camera, my fingers stiff and cold. I was kneeling by the bed, staring at a photo that had just developed in my shaking hands. It was another picture of me, standing in the middle of my room, eyes wild, mouth twisted in a grin I didn't recognize. I screamed, hurling the camera across the room, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd slipped away from myself, that the part of me that used to feel like me had crumbled, leaving behind only fragments. I sat there, clutching my head, the reality of what I'd done and what I was still doing crashing over me in waves. The whispers coiled around my thoughts, laughing at the unraveling threads of my sanity. I was losing my mind, or maybe, just maybe, it had already left. The first mistake was kindness. It was raining hard that afternoon, the kind of relentless downpour that soaked you through within seconds. I stood under the awning of the coffee shop, clutching my umbrella, waiting for the weather to ease up. That's when I saw him. A man in a threadbare coat, hair plastered to his skull, shivering against the cold. His hands were trembling as he tried and failed to light a cigarette, the flame snuffed out each time by the rain. Something about his desperation made me pause. The sensible thing would have been to turn away, mind my own business, and wait for the rain to pass. But instead, I stepped out into the downpour and handed him my umbrella. His eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment he just stared at me. Then he smiled, but it wasn't quite right. Too many teeth, too wide. "Thank you," he rasped. His voice was hoarse, almost raw. He took the umbrella with a nod, and without another word, he walked away, disappearing into the storm. I regretted it immediately. The rain hammered down, soaking me to the bone in seconds, but more than that, a strange unease settled in my gut. Still, I shrugged it off, trying to feel good about my small act of generosity. The next morning, I found the umbrella on my front doorstep. It was neatly folded, the fabric bone-dry despite the storm, and a note lay underneath. "Thank you for your kindness," it read, written in a jagged, almost desperate scrawl. "Now I owe you something." My stomach clenched at the words. Owe me something? It sounded more like a threat than a promise. I tried to forget about it, chalk it up to some weird misunderstanding, but that night, the unease came back. I was lying in bed, the room silent save for the hum of the street lamp outside my window, when I heard the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, circling my house. I shot up, heart pounding, and listened. Each step was heavy, echoing around the walls, as if someone was pacing, just outside. I grabbed my phone and tiptoed to the window, peering out into the night. The rain had stopped, but the ground was slick and glistening. At first, I saw nothing, just the empty street and shadows thrown by the street lamp. But then, just at the edge of the light, I saw him. It was the man from before. He stood there, holding the umbrella I'd given him, twirling it absently. His face was turned up toward my house, his smile wide, impossibly wide, stretching across his face in a way that made my skin crawl. I stumbled back, my hands trembling as I dialed 911. The operator picked up, but before I could say anything, the line went dead. I stared at my phone, cold dread trickling down my spine. The power flickered, the lights dimming and then surging back, and for a moment, I thought I heard laughter, faint and distorted, like a whispering echo. The next morning, everything was normal. The sun was out, the street quiet, no sign of my midnight visitor. I convinced myself I'd imagined it, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and fear, but the unease wouldn't leave. Every time I glanced at the umbrella sitting in my hallway, my chest tightened. I considered throwing it away, but something told me that wouldn't change anything. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, they weren't just outside. I heard them in the hallway, slow and deliberate, each one louder than the last. My bedroom door creaked open, and I froze, the air thick with a suffocating stillness. I couldn't see who was there, but I could feel them, their presence heavy and suffocating, pressing in around me. The umbrella lay at the foot of my bed. Shouldn't have been there. I was sure I'd left it downstairs. My heart raced as I reached for it, desperate to make it disappear, as if that might somehow make the nightmare stop. But before I could touch it, the lights cut out. Darkness swallowed the room, and I felt cold fingers brush my cheek. "You were kind?" A voice whispered, low and cold, right next to my ear. "Now let me return the favor." The next morning, the police found my house empty. The door was unlocked, the furniture untouched. Only the umbrella remained, lying open in the middle of my living room, and no one ever saw me again. It was 3 in the morning when I heard the music. The familiar, cheerful jingle drifted in through my open window, a sound that shouldn't exist at this hour. The ice cream truck, the one that usually drove around our neighborhood in the afternoons, was playing its melody as if it were a summer afternoon instead of the dead of night. The strangeness of it slithered under my skin, making the hairs on my arms stand on end. I rolled out of bed and went to the window, pushing the curtain aside just a crack. The street was quiet, the only light coming from the dim, flickering street lamp 2 houses down. But then, there it was, the ice cream truck, parked in front of my house, its garish colors distorted in the darkness. The jingle played on, broken and warped, like a child's lullaby on a warped record. There was no driver in sight. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the unease, but the truck remained, still as a tomb. My heart beat faster, an instinctive fear kicking in, and I pulled the curtain shut. I told myself it was a prank, something stupid kids were doing to scare the neighborhood. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The music kept playing, and with each note, it felt as if the walls of my house were getting closer, pressing in. I stumbled back to bed, trying to calm my racing mind. I lay there, eyes closed tight, forcing myself to ignore the creeping fear, the irrational dread. But just as I was beginning to drift back into sleep, I heard it. The soft patter of footsteps outside my bedroom window, slow and careful. My heart seized. I didn't dare move, barely even breathed, but the footsteps continued, circling the house. The music from the truck outside changed, growing quieter, a lullaby coaxing me into some restless, nightmarish sleep. My eyelids felt heavy, too heavy, and I slipped under. I woke to sunlight streaming into my room, the morning quiet and innocent, with no sign of the ice cream truck or its sinister song. I exhaled a shaky laugh, the tension slipping from my shoulders. It had to have been a dream. A stupid, vivid dream brought on by too much late-night caffeine and an overactive imagination. I swung my legs out of bed and froze. There, on my ankle, was a thin, red line, as if someone had drawn a circle around it with a piece of wire. My stomach lurched, and I reached down to touch it, the skin tender and sore. A chill settled over me, and I remembered the dream, except now it didn't feel like just a dream. The ice cream truck's jingle echoed faintly in my mind, and I wondered, desperately, if I'd really imagined it or if something had followed me from the night, leaving its mark. Some doors are better left unopened. That was the rule at the office. I'd worked the night janitor shift in the high-rise building downtown for 2 years, and in that time, I'd heard more stories about the infamous locked staircase than I cared to count. Nobody used it, nobody even talked about it seriously. The official explanation was that it was closed off for maintenance, though the maintenance sign had gathered enough dust to tell me that no one had touched that staircase in years. The night was quiet, just the way I liked it. The air conditioners hummed softly, the fluorescent lights flickered occasionally, and the silence stretched long and still. I made my rounds, mop in hand, and thought about heading to the break room for a coffee. That's when I heard it. A soft, shuffling noise coming from the stairwell. I froze, grip tightening around the mop handle. My brain searched for a logical explanation, maybe a rat or the air shifting through the old vents. But the shuffling continued, slow and deliberate, like footsteps dragging against the concrete. I shouldn't have gone closer. I shouldn't have even considered it, but something pulled at me, a curiosity I couldn't ignore. The door to the staircase was padlocked, rusted with age, but as I approached, I noticed the chain hanging loose. The lock had been broken, dangling from one end, like an invitation. My mouth went dry. I pushed the door open, and it groaned on its hinges, the sound echoing into the dark void of the stairwell. The air inside was thick, stale, and carried a faint metallic scent. Each step I took echoed too loudly, bouncing back at me from above and below. The staircase spiraled down into darkness. So far I couldn't see where it ended, and the feeling that I was being watched clung to me like a shadow. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, and my gut screamed at me to turn back. But the footsteps, those dragging footsteps, resumed, this time from below. I clutched the mop tighter, my breath coming out in ragged gasps. I called out, my voice quivering, "Hello!" The sound swallowed my words, and the stairwell fell silent once more. I took one step down, then another, the shuffling growing louder, closer. It was coming up toward me, slow but steady. I felt rooted to the spot, a deer caught in headlights, fear crawling up my spine. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I spun around to run back into the hallway, but the door to the office floor had slammed shut. I grabbed the handle, twisted, pulled, but it wouldn't budge. My knuckles whitened as I pounded on the metal, desperation flooding through me. The footsteps stopped, right behind me. A cold breath brushed the back of my neck, and I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that I wasn't alone. "Why did you come down?" A voice rasped, so close that I could feel the chill of each word against my skin. My heart hammered in my chest, and I turned slowly, the world spinning around me. And then I woke up. Gasping for air, I sat up in bed, drenched in sweat. It was just a nightmare. The relief was short-lived, though. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and felt something cold brush against my ankle. My pulse raced. I glanced down to see a dusty, rusted chain resting on the floor, a broken padlock tangled around my foot. Grief does strange things to people. I visited my brother's grave every week, rain or shine. It had been nearly 6 months since the accident, but the pain still felt fresh, raw, like an unhealed wound that I couldn't stop picking at. The cemetery was always quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that seems to hold secrets, pressing down on you like a weighted blanket. I'd kneel in the dirt, lay down flowers, and talk to him, pretending he could hear me. It was a ritual, something that kept me tethered to reality. That day was no different. The air was heavy with mist, curling around the old, cracked headstones. I ran my fingers over his name carved in the cold stone, feeling the rough edges. "Hey, Michael," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. "I brought your favorite. Daisies, remember?" As if in response, the wind picked up, rustling through the twisted branches of the nearby oaks. I shivered, pulling my coat tighter around me. It was foolish, I knew, to keep coming here, but guilt is a stubborn thing. The what-ifs and should-haves haunted me, gnawed at my mind. Maybe that's why, at first, I didn't question the small, folded piece of paper tucked under the bouquet from last week. It hadn't been there before. I unfolded it, my hands trembling. The handwriting was unmistakable, a looping scrawl I knew too well. Michael's handwriting. The note read, "It's not safe here anymore." The letters were smudged, as if the ink had run, but the message was clear. I dropped the paper, a cold sweat breaking out across my skin. "Who's doing this?" I whispered to no one, but the mist seemed to close in tighter, pressing against me. I stormed over to the groundskeeper's shed, my pulse racing. I found him inside, an old man with tired eyes and a faded cap. "Did you put this on my brother's grave?" I demanded, holding up the note. He frowned, squinting at the paper. "I haven't touched a thing," he said, voice gravelly. "But you should go home. It gets dark fast out here." That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd made a mistake. The words from the note echoed in my mind, a warning I didn't understand. Sleep came slowly, plagued with nightmares of the cemetery, of shadows moving between the graves. The next morning, I went back, driven by a restless need for answers. The mist had lifted, leaving behind an eerie stillness. But when I reached Michael's grave, I stopped dead. The flowers I'd left were uprooted, torn from the soil, and the ground around the headstone was disturbed, muddy, as if someone had been digging. A fresh note lay on top of the overturned earth. "You didn't listen." I staggered back, my heart thundering in my chest. A low sound rumbled through the cemetery, something between a groan and a whisper. I turned, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing in the distance, tall and unnervingly still. Its face was shadowed, but its posture was familiar, horribly familiar. "Michael!" I croaked, but the figure didn't move, didn't breathe. The air felt thick, heavy, and I realized too late that something was wrong. The ground beneath my feet was shifting, sinking. I tried to run, but the earth collapsed, pulling me down. Mud filled my mouth, my lungs, and I clawed desperately at the soil, but it swallowed me whole. The last thing I saw was the shadowy figure, watching me with hollow eyes, as if mourning the sister he couldn't save. The next day, the groundskeeper found a new grave where there hadn't been one before. My name was carved into the stone, a cruel end to a story that should have never been told. We shouldn't have ignored the warnings. It had been my idea to take a weekend hiking trip to Clearwater National Park. My girlfriend, Sam, and I both needed a break from the grind, and the idea of disconnecting sounded perfect. The drive had been long, the forest sprawling endlessly on either side, a reminder of just how small we were out here. By the time we parked and geared up, the sun was already drifting lower, casting the woods in a warm, golden glow. We'd planned to stick to the main trails, the ones marked on our map, but halfway through our hike we saw it. A narrow, overgrown path that branched off into the trees. It wasn't on our map, and that should have been our first red flag. But there was something oddly inviting about it, as if it wanted us to follow. I made a joke about discovering a hidden waterfall, and Sam laughed, so we decided to explore. The deeper we went, the thicker the trees grew, twisting and gnarled like old, arthritic fingers. The air seemed to cool, heavy with the scent of damp earth. The forest around us darkened, shadows stretching across the ground, and I had the distinct feeling we were being watched. I brushed it off, chalking it up to my overactive imagination. We walked for what felt like hours, but the path only twisted further into the unknown. The abandoned backpacks and half-collapsed tents came first, lying forgotten among the roots. A chill crept up my spine, and Sam went pale, muttering something about people who had clearly left in a hurry. Then we noticed the carvings on the tree trunks, deep and angry scratches that formed the words, "Turn back." My heart thudded in my chest. "We should go," Sam whispered, her voice brittle. We turned around, but the path we'd come from was gone. The woods had swallowed it up, and in its place was an endless stretch of trees that all looked the same. Panic surged through me, and we began to walk faster, desperately hoping we'd stumble upon the main trail again. But we didn't. The carvings appeared on more trees, each one seeming to leer at us as we passed. "You're lost. Don't look behind." I squeezed Sam's hand, and we broke into a jog, the quiet of the forest oppressive, the weight of being truly alone pressing down on us. Our breathing grew ragged, each step an effort. Suddenly, the ground beneath me shifted. I stumbled, catching myself on a branch. Sam screamed. She was staring at something behind me, her eyes wide with a terror I'd never seen before. I whipped around, but there was nothing, just the endless, twisting trees. "What did you see?" I demanded, my voice cracking. Sam shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "We have to keep moving," she gasped. The light was fading fast, and we were losing all sense of direction. We stumbled through the woods, tripping over roots and fallen branches. Every so often, I thought I heard something, a rustle, a whisper, but whenever I turned, nothing was there. We were being herded, I realized. Whatever was out here was leading us deeper, pushing us further from safety. We broke into a clearing, gasping for breath. At its center stood a small wooden sign, so weathered it was barely legible, "Last Chance." Beyond it, the trees closed in, darker than ever, as if they were suffocating the remaining daylight. I grabbed Sam's arm. "This way," I urged, though I didn't know where I was going anymore. She hesitated, then followed. We didn't notice the roots until it was too late. They twisted around our ankles, pulling us down. I fell hard, my head smacking against a rock. Stars exploded in my vision, and everything went black. When I woke up, it was silent. The forest loomed around me, impenetrable. Sam was gone. I called her name until my throat was raw, but there was no response. Only then did I notice the new carving on a tree beside me. "She's mine now." My hands trembled as I pushed myself to my feet. The forest felt alive, pulsing with a presence I couldn't see. I stumbled back the way we'd come, or thought we had. But the trees all blurred together, whispering secrets I didn't want to hear. I ran until my legs gave out, the weight of the woods pressing in, and I knew, with a sinking dread, that neither of us would ever leave this place. The rangers found only my backpack 2 days later, lying in a clearing that hadn't existed on any map, next to a tree that whispered, "Another one lost." I shouldn't have pulled up the floorboards. When my girlfriend, Claire, and I bought the old house on Holloway Street, we were excited about the history and the potential for making it our own. The place creaked and groaned, the kind of house that felt like it was hiding secrets, but we'd convinced ourselves it only added to the charm. We spent our weekends peeling back layers of wallpaper, stripping old paint, and digging through years of dust and neglect. That's how I found the diary. It was buried under the floorboards in one of the upstairs bedrooms, wedged between the joists. The leather cover was cracked and brittle, the pages yellowed with age. Curiosity won out over caution, and I flipped it open, expecting to find old grocery lists or long-forgotten to-do notes. Instead, the entries were detailed and unsettling. They belonged to a girl named Emily, who once lived in this house decades ago. Her handwriting was loopy and innocent at first, talking about school, her friends, her dreams. But the tone shifted, the words growing shaky. She wrote about hearing whispers in the night, shadows that crept along the walls even when the lights were on. "I think he's watching me," one entry read. "He doesn't like it when I tell people. I don't feel safe anymore." A chill settled over me, prickling the back of my neck. I glanced around the empty room, half expecting to see one of those shadows peeking back at me. The air felt heavier, and the afternoon sunlight streaming through the dusty windows seemed dimmer, almost as if the house was holding its breath. I told myself I was overreacting, that it was just an old diary, the musings of a frightened girl. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. That night, as Claire and I went about our usual routine, I kept glancing over my shoulder, my heart skipping every time the floorboards creaked or the wind rattled the windows. The sense of being watched was suffocating, pressing down on my chest. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard something. A soft rustle, a whisper just out of reach. Claire drifted off easily, her breathing slow and even, but I lay there wide awake, listening. The darkness of the room felt alive, and my mind played tricks on me, turning the shapes of the furniture into silhouettes, into figures standing just beyond the bed. The diary haunted me. The next day, I couldn't resist opening it again. The final entry sent a shiver down my spine. If you're reading this, he already knows. He's coming for you, too. The words were smudged, the ink bleeding, almost as if Emily had been crying when she wrote them. Or in a hurry. I couldn't shake the paranoia. Every room in the house felt smaller, every shadow more sinister. I'd turn a corner and swear I saw something dart out of view. Hear footsteps echo down the hall only to find nothing there. The sense of being pursued, of something unseen closing in, gnawed at me. Claire noticed my jumpiness, but I brushed it off, trying to hide the growing panic that felt more real with every passing hour. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard the floorboards groan outside our room. Slow, deliberate steps, one after another, growing louder. My heart pounded, and I reached out to wake Claire, but she wasn't there. Her side of the bed was cold, the sheets rumpled. The steps stopped just outside the door, and the knob began to turn, ever so slowly. I bolted upright, adrenaline surging. The door creaked open an inch, and I held my breath, waiting, every muscle in my body taut. But nothing came through. Silence stretched on, thick and oppressive. Then I felt it, a cold breath against my ear, a presence leaning in so close I could feel the chill radiating off it. My voice caught in my throat, terror rooting me to the spot. I turned slowly, expecting to come face to face with whatever had been watching me, whatever Emily had feared. And then I woke up. Sweat soaked the sheets, my pulse racing. The nightmare had been so vivid, so real, that I could still feel the cold spot where the presence had hovered beside me. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the lingering dread. As I sat up, my heart sank. My forearm burned, and I looked down to see fresh, red scratches trailing up my skin. The same words from Emily's diary had been carved into my flesh. He already knows. The house was silent, but the feeling of being hunted, of something lurking just out of sight, stayed with me. No longer just a dream, it was a warning I couldn't escape. Be sure to subscribe, dear viewers.